Coming up on the Authorpreneur podcast.
In this episode, I'm going to discuss how I edit my outline. I know what you're thinking. After that 3-part episode of my outlining process, she then goes and edits her outline. Yeah, I do. And this is something I've done because I've wanted to learn from past mistakes. And I've realized that it's actually easier to edit plot issues before they're set in stone, before they're set. Like when you go through the process of writing your first draft, the plot's there on the page. Whereas with the outlining process, it is moldable to a certain extent. Now, in saying that, I do write in the mystery genre, so a lot of the plot threads that I do leave, or the plot points I leave, are quite intricate. So if you rush through one of my mystery novels, you miss one of my plot threads, on the occasion I do get a reader that says, oh, she raised this plot thread, but she hasn't resolved it. And it's not entirely accurate because they've read the book in haste. And what I do is I'll raise a plot thread, and then later in the book, when it's a more convenient time, I will resolve the plot thread. Usually in that final act, all of these things are lined up. And if you zoom through a mystery novel, sometimes you miss these things and they are left in the reviews, but that's rare now. Whereas with my first book, there was more than one person saying, well, these issues were raised and I was wondering what happened with this. And I was like, oh yeah, that's a good point. Because sometimes when you edit, it's hard to see that you haven't wrapped these things up on the page, but you've wrapped them up in here. So I find that editing going through this process of editing my outline actually helps me to realize actually what's in here isn't actually on the page. And I can only say it works for me. So I thought as a conclusion to wrap up how I outline a novel, it might be nice for me to talk about how I edit my outline before I then go into scenes and all those other elements of outlining that are important to know about.
Welcome to the Authorpreneur podcast. I'm your host, mystery author Amelia D. Hay. On this podcast, I will bring you writing, book marketing, and self-publishing advice so that you can create your dream author business, build your author platform, and be creatively independent. You can find the episode show notes and lots more information on the podcast page at authorpreneurpodcast.com/podcast.
Hello, writers. So you've created an outline for your novel, and now you're ready to start writing. Diving into the first draft seems like the first logical step. However, I recommend you slow down and edit the outline of your novel. I learned this lesson the hard way after publishing my first in series novella. To this day, I regret not going back and editing the outline of that novel. There were minor things that were not wrapped up at the end that I believed were wrapped up rather subtly, but the reader needed more clarity around these issues. They needed it to be less subtle and more obvious. They needed to see the person getting arrested by the police and listing out the crimes, just so some people needed that, some people were fine, but it was sort of like a 60-40 split. If I edited the outline before starting to write the first draft, I would have fixed these issues before they were issues. By the time you get to the revision stage, it's difficult to see all of the errors, especially if you're a new writer and you don't have an established team of beta readers or a critique partner who is a little more seasoned than you. This episode isn't scripted, because I want it to be a chat about how I edit the outline of a novel. In saying that, I have compiled a list of steps and broke down exactly how I edit the outline of a story. Each of these steps has a bullet point list of notes to help me stay on track. I'm sharing this with you so that you know that I've thought about this episode in detail and I'm not just making it up as I go along. Part of the reason why these notes exist is I want to remind myself these are the intricate steps that I take, because I am a little concerned that if I just talk by the seat of my pants that I'm going to forget about something that's actually really vital. And the reason why I won't share it is because I know you need to do those things. But if you're not familiar with my process, you're probably not going to know, not going to realize, oh, doing this is actually really important. For those of you who are new to this podcast, I want to say a huge thank you for stopping by and trying out my show. To those of you who've been faithfully listening in, thank you for regularly listening in and supporting me. Your support means more to me than you know. So before I dive into how I edit an outline of a novel, here's what you need to know about how I write. I write in scenes, not chapters. Division into chapters happens after the outlining phase. And the reason why I'm so fixated on scenes is I started learning, when I learned how to write, I was studying screenwriting. So screenwriting is it's scene by scene. So I'm very familiar with the concept of a scene. So when I transferred from screenwriting to writing novels, I was like, what's a chapter? Like, I've read chapters before, but I couldn't work out, is a chapter a scene? Is it one scene per chapter? What are these breaks? Like, I never questioned it when I read. I was just reading for enjoyment, and I had to wrap my mind around that. So that's why I'm fixated on scenes. I write murder mysteries with more than one point of view character. And my outlining process, as well as how I edit my outline, has evolved over the course of writing 5 fiction works in the mystery genre. Every scene or chapter of my novel raises a question about the story. So, in terms of plot, character motivations, after every scene, as the reader turns the page, there's a question there that I'm hoping they're thinking. They're sort of thinking about a question. So without further ado, let's get into the show. So step number 1 is to create a list of plot questions in every scene or chapter of your story. So I'm going to go over to my desktop and I'm going to show you the outline spreadsheet for the first book in my Rookie Reporter series, which is called The Candidates. So here it is. I've tried to sort of hide the important information. So I'm going to try and, for those of you on the podcast, I'm going to share a screenshot of this outline spreadsheet with spoilers sort of hidden, but I will show you the scene that I'm talking about, and that will be at authorpreneurpodcast.com/TAP037. So this first column is the act, and I don't put this for every scene. I've just written it to the first person for the first person, and it's not on the screen actually. It's not on the video right now because I've zoomed in so you can sort of see what I've actually written in the cells, because that's probably more important than you seeing everything. So then column B is a plot point, C is a scene number, and I've got title, point of view character, the location, then I've got the scene goal, the scene type, and then I've got this column and it says plot, and this is just a 1-sentence summary of the plot. Then I've got scene blocking notes, and that's just to help me to write the scene, to remind me this is what I want to put in this scene. The next one is the value shift or the turning point. So I've got a value shift or a turning point column for the start of the scene and one for the end. Then I've got conflict, stakes, cliffhanger, and then I've got this question. So in the opening scene of the candidate, you can see this in the look inside, so it's no secret. So the scene opens with this unidentified older man walking. Well, he's not really walking, he's staggering. He pulls his bodkin arrow out of his chest. He sort of gets up he lifts himself up in his study, and he wanders out of his study and down the hall of his pristine white hall, and he's leaving a trail of blood behind, and you sort of get to see what he's thinking in his final hours. And then he's struggling. He grabs his house keys and decides he's going to drive and not wake up his pregnant wife. And you sort of get his struggle, and he decides where he's going to go. And you're thinking, because he realizes he's not going to make it to hospital. He's going to die on the way. And even if he calls for an ambulance, he's going to die waiting. End of discussion. And he realizes he shouldn't have pulled the arrow out of his chest, but he made a huge mistake, and that's what he's done. And then he goes, what am I going to do? And he decides where he's going to go. And you sort of get the hint that is he going to hospital? Where is he going? And these are the questions that I want the reader to be asking. Like, who is this person? Where is he going? How did this happen to him? Like, how did he end up on the floor of his office with a bodkin arrow in his chest? And who has a bodkin arrow laying around in their office? Like, these are the questions I want the reader to be asking at the end of this scene. So if you don't have this column in your outline spreadsheet, what are you going to do? Because this column is how I edit my outline. It wasn't there to serve the purpose. I just put it in there because I was like, well, what questions do the scene raise? And I would just fill out the column in missing I did this, and I didn't actually go back and check it. Just for some reason that didn't register for me, and I really wish it did. So what do you do if you don't have this column? I would just go through your outline spreadsheet, whatever it looks like, and ask yourself the following question. At the end of this scene, what will the reader be asking as they turn the page? What will they want to know more about? And then write those questions, either add it to a column in your spreadsheet. Maybe you should do that. Add it to a column in your spreadsheet. I usually just have one cell for all of the questions, and I just sort of type them in there, because usually for me there's more than one. Like, on the occasion there is just one question, and this is indicative of the genre I write in too. If you're writing romance, you probably won't have like a lot of questions. Sometimes you'll only have one question, and that's fine. You just need to sort of keep in mind what your genre is and whether what you're writing actually works with the genre. Step 2 is, for each question, comb through your outline spreadsheet and check if the question has been answered. So honestly, this step is obviously self-explanatory. So you just need to write out all the questions, copy them over from your outline spreadsheet, and put them in a separate document. And leave room underneath for you to write out the answer to the question and list the scene number. So in brackets you'll have, actually I got something even better. I should just read you an example. So in that particular scene I just shared with you, I can't remember what I've called the document, but I think it's like a list of questions raised in the candidate. And in scene 1, I've got, will this man die or get to the hospital in time? And it's like, who is this guy? Where is he going? And what has happened to him? So in scene 5, which is like in four scenes time, I don't think it's available in the look inside, but that's not the point. I've written, will this man die or get to the hospital in time? And the answer that I've written here is yes. Enter scene number. Albert's body is found in this location, but the protagonist, James Long, doesn't see the body until this scene after, this event takes place. And then with the second question, who is this guy? Where is he going? And what has happened to him? I wrote in scene X, the reader learns who this man is, and they learn where he was going. And also later on in the story, as the crime has resolved, you learn what has actually happened to him, like what events sort of took place that led him to have the bodkin arrow in his chest. So step 3 is search through your list of questions for those questions that haven't been answered and highlight these in a different color. The reason why I like to highlight them in a different color is just they stand out as not being answered. I know it should be obvious enough that there's no answer underneath. But for me, I just need to make it a little bit more obvious. So as I sort of flip my eyes through the document, I can see these things jump out at me. So these unanswered questions are potential plot issues that need to be addressed in your story, but not all of them will be plot issues, especially if you write in a series and there's certain things that are happening over a series. You'll be fascinated to know I don't actually outline my series. Like, I've got ideas of what is going to happen, but I just don't outline it in that way. I guess that's where the freedom for me comes from. I'm not just, because if I outlined both, I think I would feel very suffocated. But I'm like almost pantsing the series, but I'm heavily outlining the individual stories, novels, episode.
If you've heard something useful in this episode that was helpful to you and you'd like to support the show, then buy me a coffee for as little as $2 at buymeacoffee.com/author ADH.
Step number 4, categorize your unanswered plot questions. If you're writing in a series, there will naturally be no more than 1 or 2 unanswered questions in a novel that relate to a series arc, even if this series arc isn't outlined ahead of time. While I outline my stories, I don't outline the series, but I have a vague idea of what's going to happen in the future. And these are, I guess, moments along James Alon's story arc. That's sort of how I know what's going to happen in the future. But back to editing your outline. So here's the key that I use. I like to highlight the questions not answered but will be answered throughout the series in red. Loose threads that need to be resolved before the start of Act 2 are highlighted in blue. And loose threads that need to be resolved by the end of Act 3 are highlighted in yellow. So I do have a few things that need to be resolved before the start of Act 3, so technically by the end of Act 2. And that's because I don't want to leave too many open threads in Act 3, because Act 3 technically is only 25% of your story. And you don't want it to drag out forever. You want there to be a bit of balance in the novel, in the arc of your novel. So that's why I do that. So step number 5 is decide whether you need to add new scenes to your outline. So ask yourself, which questions can be answered in your existing outlined scenes? And what questions require new scenes or multiple scenes in order to give, that satisfying answer to your reader? Because sometimes some plot threads it can be sometimes unbelievable to add all of these things into a single scene, that they probably need to happen over a period of time, and the protagonist needs to pick up the pieces in that way. And do any of your questions require you to make edits to multiple scenes? So for the questions that can be answered using the scenes that already exist in your outline, just write the scene number or numbers in parentheses and followed by the answer. So as you might have guessed, simply write add scene for questions, add new scene for questions that require a new scene, and then just write out what will be in that scene. So I'm going to walk you through a few examples from my upcoming book 2 in my James Alon mystery series. So the reason why I have these as open, this book has been written and it's in the process. I went through and I rewrote it, and now I'm revising the rewritten version of the book. So before I rewrite the book I didn't rewrite the book from scratch, but before I changed one of the major plot elements of the story, I went through and I did this. And then I realized, you know what, I should have done, and that's when I had the epiphany, I should have done this in the outlining phase. So there's going to be spoilers. Not that a reader is listening to this podcast and going, bummer, I can't read that book now. But I just thought I'd point it out. So in scene 7, that particular scene, actually I've chosen 2 scenes that only raise technically one question. So in scene 7, it's what do the symbols mean? Where will the message lead them? So in one of the scenes, there is they discover something and it has this symbol and this message written in its margins. It's obviously manuscript. So this particular question, it isn't answered in this story because it's a part of a longer story arc. So this object will become relevant again in a future story. So this is an example of, because it's highlighted in red, a question's not answered but will be answered throughout the series. So that's an example of that. And it does relate to James because he discovers it. He discovers something that's relevant to it. Or he has this sort of epiphany about this is what this means. And the next example is an example of a loose thread that needs to be resolved at the end of Act 3. So somewhere along the line, you realize that one of the bad guy's henchmen has an informant at the police station, and you suddenly learn that the police investigations is being manipulated. And it's sort of obvious in a way, but it becomes more obvious. So the question the reader asks at the end of this scene is, who is this person's informant at the police station? Because you see them talking to them. You see it from the bad guy's point of view, and he's talking to someone at the police station, but because it's from their point of view, they don't reveal who their informant is because they're making the call in a public place. And as I answer this scene, I'm not going to go into all of the detail of what I've written here because I've realized it is super spoilery. So I've said that this informant is someone who works at the police station who believes that this other person is being framed by James, and he actually legitimately committed the crimes because he has a loose connection with somebody else who has an interest in this, and they think, oh, they must want it for themselves and they must be trying to steal it instead of buying it, going through the appropriate channels and buying it. So I've suggested maybe somewhere close to the midpoint there needs to be a scene that cuts to the informant who is close to the leading detective, and you sort of see them starting to panic about getting caught because they are almost caught by somebody else who works in the police station. So this loose end needs to be foreshadowed in Act 2, but resolved in Act 3. I can't remember if I actually did this or whether I just sort of created the scene, revealed who it was, and then they got caught. Actually, I think I did this. I revealed who it was in Act 2, and then in Act 3, I sort of make sure that this person is caught. So step 6 is to brainstorm solutions to these unanswered questions. And these unanswered questions are obviously not the series arc questions, but the questions that actually need to be answered within this current book. So as you brainstorm solutions to this, add these answers to the questions just like I did above. And then as you're brainstorming and you're confident that, yes, this is how I want to resolve this particular plot thread, then go ahead and transfer it to your outline spreadsheet by altering existing scenes or adding new scenes. And with my outline spreadsheet, when I start altering the scenes during the editing process, I will go through and I'll highlight the scene that I've done this to, where if I've added a new scene, I'll say this is a scene that I've added. I'll highlight that a different color, and on the first tab I'll have I call it like a revision key, and you'll see the scenes that I've just made minor adjustments to, I'll highlight in a different color, and then the new scene will be a different color. And then scenes that I delete, if that's ever a thing, if I ever delete a scene, I will then transfer it over to a different tab. I won't actually I'll move it from the edited outline, but I won't completely delete it from the Excel workbook. I'll have it in a different tab just in case I change my mind. Because sometimes in this creative process, I can be this is going to sound tragic, but a bit indecisive about what I want to do. And sometimes I will change my mind. It's I think I've become insecure about the decision I made and that I decided to change my mind. Step number 7, and this is something I've done just recently with book 2 in the James Alon mystery series, and that is to search for disappearing characters. So comb through your outline and look for casts that appear and interact with the protagonist on multiple occasions but just completely disappear. For example, I had a character in, just like I said, book 2, and they assisted James with a few tasks, and then they just completely disappear 3/4 of the way through the second act. So this character roughly appeared in 4 or 5 scenes, and I think they got a POV scene because they were doing something separate to James, but it was relevant for the reader to see it. Because I set this character up, I needed to make sure they have a minor wrap-up in the final act of the story. I need to answer the reader question, what happened to this person? From previous experience, there will be a reader who will want to know this. Trust me, readers will notice and make comments in reviews about things like this where characters sort of disappear. If you notice this now, think of a way that you can give a character an ending and add this to a scene in the final act of the story, in the denouement or the return to the real world plot point. I'm just going to open my notes and run through these steps for you. So in order for you to edit your outline, you need to create a list of plot questions in every scene or chapter of your story. For each question, comb through your outline spreadsheet and check the question has been answered. Search through your list of questions and look for questions that haven't been answered and highlight these in a different color. Next, categorize your unanswered plot questions. Decide whether you need to add new scenes to your outline or whether you can just edit the existing scenes. Brainstorm solutions to these unanswered questions. And the final step is just to look for disappearing characters and make sure you wrap up their storyline by the end of the 3rd act. So in terms of editing your outline, this is all you can revise. Everything outside of this needs to wait until you write the first draft. The purpose of editing your outline is to ensure that you're not making major plot rewrites during the revision stage, especially ones that could have been picked up at the start. I hope this episode gives you a few things to consider as you outline your first or next book. As always, I have a few important questions to ask. How do you outline your novels? Or how are you outlining your first story? And do you edit your outline before you write your first draft? I want to hear from you. Share your process or struggles with outlining in the comments section below or over in the Am Writing Fiction Facebook group. Thank you for listening and happy reading and writing, everybody.
Thank you for listening to the Authorpreneur podcast. If you love this episode, then hit the subscribe button and leave a review on your favourite podcasting app. I'm your host, Amelia D. Hay, and I'll see you next week for another episode.